His latest book is called Cheap Speech: How Disinformation Poisons Our Politics and How to Cure It. Rick, thanks for coming in. I want to start with something that's had a lot of developments kind of on the side of what's been happening with the committee over the course of the last several weeks. The fake electors plan, which the Justice Department has made very clear with some actions they're really digging into right now. Do you see that as a criminal angle here with the most legs?
Well, I mean, there are multiple paths by which different actors could be found liable, right? We already have people who physically stormed the Capitol. Some of those have already been prosecuted. Some of those have already been sentenced. This fake electors is one important path. And then there's other paths too. And one I'm focused on is it's a crime to corruptly obstruct an official proceeding. And this is language that could be used against John Eastman, against Donald Trump, against Rudy Giuliani. So I don't think there's a single path, and I don't think we know yet exactly what else the Department of Justice might be looking into besides the fake electors plan.
You know, one of the things committee officials made clear today that their hearings are expected to detail the December 2020 White House meeting in which Trump advisors floated the idea of seizing voting machines. It was one of the most extraordinary meetings of a series of them over the course of that month. What do you want to know about that meeting, given how you've followed this?
So I think it's really chilling when you hear about seizing voting machines. That sure doesn't sound like the United States of America. We have a decentralized voting system. The President and the Department of Justice or the Department of Defense, they have no control over voting machines. It looks like yet another path to try to mess with the peaceful transition of power leading up to the events of January 6th. And so I think, as with a lot of these things, the question is, what was the motivation of the President and his allies in trying to do this? Did they expect that they would be able to stop the Congress from certifying that Joe Biden had won the presidency when they were going to meet on January 6th. All of these things raise issues of criminal liability, but a lot of it depends upon the state of mind of the actors who were involved in these different scenarios.
You have kind of the potential criminal path or criminal investigations, but you also have the broader issue here, which I think gets to how the committee has framed some of these things, which is that this could happen again, and that the former president is still very much a major player in a political party, could run again. You guys just launched this group, the Safeguarding Democracy group. Dozens of people involved with it, Republicans, Democrats, academics, kind of across the board. When you look at the landscape right now, what do you see as the biggest danger, biggest threat to democracy going into the next election?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, if you look at the advisory board of the Safeguarding Democracy Project at UCLA, where if you put us all in a room, we probably wouldn't agree on lots of things of substance, but we do agree in the idea of free and fair elections and peaceful transitions of power. And so we do have to look forward and ask, because the next attempt to steal an election is not going to look like the last one. What can be done on the federal, state, and local level to assure not only that we have fair elections, but elections that people can believe in and believe were conducted in a fair and trustworthy manner? And I'd say the number one thing I'm looking forward to in the next few months is if a bipartisan group of senators, as they've been speaking, are actually going to come forward with a bill that could make it through the Congress, that would change the rules around the Electoral Count Act and make it clear that someone who tries to mess with the rules in the way that Trump did or in other ways can't do that, and that the winner of the election is actually going to be declared the winner.
That had kind of a real big burst a few months ago, and then it kind of died away, which sometimes in the Senate means that things are actually getting done. You don't actually know. But one of the debates at the time was, from some Democrats, was don't accept just the bipartisan bill that's being worked on because it doesn't do everything or other critical issues that need to be addressed. Do you believe that revisions to the Electoral Count Act, should that actually reach an agreement, is enough right now or should be pursued?
I don't think you should think of it as a yes or no or an either or. The more that can be done to minimize the risk of election subversion, the better. And if you can get Republicans on board to fix the Electoral Count Act, to do things like require paper ballots so we have pieces of paper that can be recounted in the event of a problem, and to protect election officials who've been facing threats of violence, and we need to harden our systems. So if you could get agreement on that, you're going to move incrementally towards a situation where it will be harder for the next Donald Trump to steal the election.
Can I ask you, there was some news this week recently related to Wisconsin and drop boxes. There was a court ruling which effectively barred the use of drop boxes in elections in Wisconsin. what's always been interesting to me when I talk to folks about what they think happened in November of 2020, one of the things that's often brought up is drop boxes, right? Like these were, no one was securing them, no one was paying attention to them, they're very easy, they're full of fraud, all that type of stuff. Can you actually explain to people what drop boxes are, how they work in practice and in concept?
Sure. So I think that, until Donald Trump came along and started casting aspersions on drop boxes, they were not really that controversial. Yep. People vote in different ways. Some people vote in person, others vote by mail. Your ballot's mailed to you, and then how do you return it? Well, you could put it back in the mail, but another way that you could deal with it is put it into a dedicated drop box. So it's basically a government mailbox where election officials are going to pick up the mail, that just contains ballots. And, there has not been any evidence, despite this ridiculous 2000 Mules movie from Dinesh D'Souza and the statements of Donald Trump, there has been no evidence of major tampering with ballot drop boxes, with any kind of fraud. Even if you believe some of the false claims that were made about people delivering other people's ballots to these drop boxes, there was no evidence that ballots were tampered with or that the people who were actually voting, had their votes changed. So it's really, I think, just more false claims that have been thrown up against the 2020 election, which, remember, was conducted in the middle of a pandemic when people were not feeling safe about voting in person. It's just another way to try to undermine people's confidence in the election process. And if you think that the 2020 election was stolen, you might be more willing to tolerate an attempt to steal it back in 2024. And I think that's what a lot of this rhetoric is all about.
Yeah, there's a bit of a slow boil kind of thing happening to some degree, or at least it feels like that. I want to go back to the group that you launched, because I think one of the interesting things now is, you mentioned threats to democracy, the 2024 election, whether or not people are framing things in a specific manner for 2024 to be even worse than what we saw in January 6th or in the lead up to the inauguration. Most of the witnesses at this committee, the January 6th committee, have been Republicans. They were Trump supporters. They voted for Trump. There are a lot of, as you noted, Republicans on your advisory board as well. Do you feel like this is resonating in a different manner than perhaps everything else we'd seen over the course of the last year and a half post-Trump has with the rest of the country about the seriousness, the urgency of the moment?
I do think it's a smart political strategy to be putting Republicans who can be more trusted by other Republicans in front of the American people through the committee. It really was heroes who were Republicans and Democrats and independents, elected officials, election officials, judges, people who had actual power. They're the ones that stood up last time. Turns out our system depends much more on people acting in good faith than it does just very simple rules about how we're going to conduct our presidential elections. And so the danger is that the next time we're not going to have those same strong people who are acting in good faith in place everywhere to run our elections. And so thinking ahead towards the future, what can you do to bolster confidence and to bolster those people who are going to be the ones who are going to be making the decisions about whether elections are going to be certified? It's just so many moving parts when it comes to a presidential election, and we need to make sure that we have systems in place so that if someone doesn't act in good faith, there are backstops to make sure that the winner of the election is actually the one who gets to take office.
Yeah, just how dynamic the entire process is that I think everybody took for granted prior to 2020 was kind of laid so bare, and it's become very clear ever since. All right, Rick Hasen, as always, I really appreciate your expertise. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
All right, coming up, a wildfire in one of the nation's most iconic national parks has doubled in size in a day.